Good afternoon again. But for the rain, I know you'd all be out skiing, so I'm very grateful that you come back to hear me yet again. For those out there in the outer world who may see this on tape, all rumors to the contrary notwithstanding, I am still Stacy Wallach, and we are still talking about Eisenhower's presidency. And what I want to do first is just show you the syllabus again so you'll see where we are. Remember, in the first class, we did a survey of his life up to his presidency so we'd have a context in which to view what he did during the 8 years of his term. And in the second class last week, we talked about his foreign policy, and especially his views and use of nuclear weapons, and how he really was rather remarkable in threatening at appropriate times, but never using nuclear weapons. And despite a series of crises, only some of which we were able to touch on in any detail, he kept the peace for 8 years, the only two-term 20th century president to have no actual combat for Americans for 8 years. And today, we're going to talk about another rather fundamental aspect of Eisenhower's foreign policy that has had reverberations ever since his policy of secretly overthrowing foreign governments that he didn't like. Next week, we're going to talk about an equally controversial subject, civil liberties, McCarthyism, followed by, on February 14th, a discussion of civil rights and his kind of paradoxical role in it. In that discussion, I think it'll be useful to remember back to the first lecture on who he was and where he came from and what his life experiences were prior to becoming president. And finally, on February 21, we're going to talk about a few specific things that don't fit into the overall pattern that are nonetheless worth mentioning because he did some very, very important things. And then we're going to try to sum up and decide for ourselves, individually and collectively, if he really was a successful president or, as some would say, a moral failure. So that's just where we've come from and where we're going. Now, with one possible exception that I'll mention in just a second, prior to Eisenhower, the United States had never pursued a policy, an actual policy of secretly overthrowing foreign governments that it didn't approve of. At Eisenhower's express direction, that changed. And again, with that one exception that I'll mention in a moment, that may not really be an exception, it really was a fundamental change. And at the end of my part of the talking, I'm going to start calling you out to find out what you think about all of this, because it really was quite extraordinary. And with some leakage, it was largely secret during his administration. It wasn't 100% secret. There's always leakage, but it was pretty secret. Now, just to emphasize what we're about to talk about and what I believe is a fundamental difference between what had gone on before, let's take a look at our 15 major military involvements. And we're going to take about 15 seconds to do this. All right, for 215 years, we were at war with Native Americans. When I say we, I mean our European immigrant ancestors, all right? 215 years of pretty much continual warfare against Native Americans. Not secret. Everybody knew what was up. 1754 to 1763, the French and Indian War, which was really just a battlefield of the European War, the Napoleonic Wars. But, you know, we were deeply involved. Well, those of you who came over on the Mayflower were deeply involved. I was not. Then, of course, there's the American War of Independence. Nothing secret about that. The Second War of American Independence, the War of 1812. Then there was occasional naval gunboat diplomacy in the Far East to protect our mercantile interests. Nothing too serious unless you happen to be on the other end of the gunfire. Then, of course, the Great Divide, the American Civil War. And then that bloodletting kind of laid everything to rest for a while. It's the longest period of non-combat for the United States, with the one exception that I mentioned before, and I'm going to bring up in just a sec. You could legitimately ignore the Spanish-American War because the combat only lasted 90 days. From the declaration of war to the signing of the peace treaty was 4 months, but the combat only lasted 90 days. You could call it something besides a war if you were so inclined. So you could say that from 1865 to 1917, when we entered World War I mean, it's really an unparalleled period of peace for the United States. However, you could call this the Forgotten War. And I'm not sure how well known it really was, because of course the modern media, the press, the CNNs of this world, the ability to send live shots of battlefields up through the satellite and back into your home, of course none of that existed. What happened very briefly was that when we liberated, I'm putting that word in quotes, of course, when we liberated the Philippines from Spanish colonial rule, the Philippine Rebel Army, which joined in the effort and had been fighting for some time on their own, they honestly believed that we were there to free them and help them set up an independent republic. And they were stunned to discover that that's not what we had in mind at all. And when that really sank in on them, they rebelled against the American occupying troops. And from about 1899 to 1905, there was a horrific war between American troops and Philippine troops. Horrific. And even after, it kind of faded off because the American troops were successful in early 1906. By the end of 1906, the major part of that series of battles were over, but then it broke out again and ran from 1907 to 1913 at a much lower level, and finally in 1913 the last rebel units were crushed. That war was a precursor of Vietnam in so many ways that it's really frightening. It's really worth studying. The reason I say it's an exception is I really don't know very clearly how much the American people knew that this war was going on. I've read a tiny bit about it, and both Roosevelt and Taft, after him, were very fond of issuing press releases saying, oh, everything's just wonderful in the Philippines. Some minor cleanup going on around the edges, but everything's just great. And I'm not clear whether any American newspaper was actually reporting what an awful and vicious, and in my opinion, completely unjustified war it was. So that's the exception. It may really have been secret, not so much by intention, but because it was simply so far away and so beyond the interest and attention of most Americans. Then, of course, from 1913 to 1921, our wonderful President Wilson felt that it was his right to tell everybody south of the Rio Grande how to run their country. And that's no joke. He really said, I'm going to teach the South American republics to elect good men, And he sometimes actually selected the individual men that he wanted to be president and put them into power. Those were the days when, you know, particularly in Central America, if he felt things weren't going, or the Caribbean, if he felt things weren't going the way they ought to, he sent in the Marines. They were, I mean, you could argue that in those years, the Marines were a sub-department of the State Department. And just look at the list. He sent American troops into Mexico in 1914 to 16. They were in the middle of their 20-year revolution. And that I can understand a little, because that revolution and civil war is what it really was, spilled over into Texas periodically when one side or the other was being chased and wanted a little safe haven. But when he intervened, it wasn't just to keep the border secure. Believe me, his troops, the American troops, did not stop at the southern Texas border. The Dominican Republic in 1916, Haiti and Cuba in 1917, Panama in 1918, in Nicaragua during the entire 8 years of his administration. But it wasn't secret. He made no secret about it at all. It was his official policy. Then, of course, World War I. And although it wasn't well known at the time, it wasn't a secret, we, along with the Brits, intervened in Russia's civil war. Not very successfully. We went into Archangel and some places out there, supposedly to protect our interests, our economic interests. And really, most of it was over by 1920, but the last American troops only got out in 1922. And guess what? The Russians have not forgotten that. Then, of course, World War II. And in 49-50, we sent military and economic aid to the Greek government in their civil war. They really had some of you may know, a really major civil war, quite awful. And we sent in aid to oppose the communist side, but no troops. We sent in aid to Turkey to oppose Soviet efforts. You know, Russia has spent 500 years trying to get a hold of a warm water port. That's the sort of fundamental foreign policy of whoever rules Russia, whether you call it Russia or the Soviet Union. They need a warm water port. And they, at the end of World War II, they saw an opportunity to try to control the Dardanelles, which runs from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. So we helped Turkey oppose that. And finally, the Korean War. So all of this, you know, 15 major conflicts, with that one possible exception, were wide open. We never made a secret about what we were doing. And by the way, you could conclude. Why don't you take this seat right here? Just, whoops, right over here. You could say we're a very warlike people, or you could say we're people that has had a lot of wars thrust on us. It's not my point. My point is simply, for the entire history of the United States up until Dwight Eisenhower, whatever we did do, we did openly. Openly effected. Ike and Allen Dulles would change that, and they would change it almost right away. And it's really extraordinary. It's like, you know, watching from a rowboat an aircraft carrier making a 90-degree turn. It's a very impressive shift. The unseen part of Ike's new look. Remember, we talked about the new look last week. Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, Indonesia in 1958, and Cuba in 60-61. Those are the ones we know about. It wouldn't surprise me at all if there are others that we still don't know about. In Iran, it was all about oil. There has never been a more naked assertion of European-American power politics than when it came to oil. And as you can see, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company discovered major oil fields in Iran in 1908. That was just when the British and American navies were in the process of switching over from coal to oil. The APOC, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, became the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and much, much, much later, after decades later, that company ultimately turned into what we know as today BP. They didn't just discover the oil, they owned the land under which the oil lay. I don't know whether they bought it or took it. They probably bought it, but they owned it. And the British owned the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And they did something which landlords of retail stores, landlords of buildings in which there are retail stores, know all about. They said to first the Persians and then the Iranians, they said, we'll give you a piece of the net profits, not a piece of the gross, a piece of the net profits. I think it was 6%. If you're a landlord of a building that has a retail store, the guy says, well, I'll give you 20% of my net profits. So as I grow, you grow, Mr. Landlord. No, 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 says the smart landlord. I'll take 5% of the gross. I don't want to get involved in your bookkeeping. Just show me the cash register tapes. I'll take 5% of that. Because, of course, creative bookkeeping is where the profit is. And the Brits, who are not shy, went a step further. They said, not only will we give you 6% of the net profits after we do the accounting, we're not going to give you the right to look at the books. Not bad, huh? And because of the size of the oil and the size of the profits, they had a huge number of employees. They were not the most generous of employers, as nobody was in those days. So there's a history here which we can only touch on briefly. This is, on the left, with Truman, Little Shah. His father, Big Shah, was the Shah during World War II and made an unfortunate strategic choice. He decided to side with the Germans. And that didn't sit too well when the British and Americans invaded Iran during World War II and took it over. And indeed forced him to abdicate in favor of Little Shah. And the Russians were deeply involved too, as the Russians have long been involved in Iran because they sit directly on Iran's northern border. And of course, Iran has a warm water port. So after World War II, as the Cold War started to develop and British and American statesmen started to realize this is an important area, not just for the oil, but to contain Soviet expansionism, the Brits actually came to the United States and said, we're essentially bankrupt because of the war. We need you to take over some of our former international obligations, or colonies, as you will. But in fact, the end of the war brought a resurgence all around the world of nationalism in all of these former colonies. And Iran was no different. They're very, very well-educated, sophisticated, cultured people with a long, long history, as you know. They're not Arabs, they're Persians. And so in 1951, the Iranian legislature nationalized AIOC's Iranian oil fields. Now, they didn't do it like on Tuesday morning at 3 o'clock or at 11 o'clock because they thought it was a good idea. They went to the British and said, look, 6% is not appropriate. Let's sit down and negotiate a deal. The Americans, Aramco, but also American government officials, are at this moment sitting down with the Saudi Arabians doing the same kind of negotiation we're suggesting. Let's talk this through and work out something fair. The British had a very interesting response. It consisted of one word: no. Right? So they went and they tried to get some international help. They went to the UN. The UN strongly recommended that the British sit down with the Iranians. They again said no. So the legislature nationalized the oil fields when it really became clear, oh, the Brits went to the Americans and said, help us out here. And Truman said, no, sit down with the Iranians and work things out. Yes, sir.
It's interesting because the British had just nationalized the coal fields, the electric companies, and the railways.
Yes, and it was.
Country.
That's right, and it was in that context that occurred. Absolutely. So they nationalized it, and the Brits went to some sort of international arbitration and some kind of. They were knocked down at every stage because their position was neither reasonable nor effective. So the fellow on the right, a very popular politician, became the president in a very, very democratic, fair election. His name is Mohammad Mossadegh, and he had two characteristics. On the one hand, he was an extremely skillful politician, a real nationalist, very, very accomplished, and for a time, hugely popular. The other aspect was his own personality. He was peculiar. He was just peculiar. We don't have the time to go into it, but he was just a very peculiar guy. But no question that he was a popularly elected prime minister who was carrying out the will of his people. But this was important for Great Britain to a degree that it's hard for us to imagine today. Iran supplied close to 90% of Western Europe's oil imports at that time. Close to 90%. But more importantly, the British government profits from their oil company was what balanced their budget. I mean, they were just in 50 and 51, 5-6 years after World War II ended, they were just at the barest beginnings of an economic recovery from the devastation of the war. And the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company profits were absolutely critical to their economy. We can't underplay that. In 1950, in late 1950, Britain, through the British equivalent of the CIA, through MI6, came over and asked their help in overthrowing Mossadegh and restoring the company and the oil to Great Britain. Harry Truman said no, and in 1953 they came back and asked again, and Eisenhower said yes. And the question is why? Mossadegh, interestingly enough, despite the fact that he now controlled the oil wells, had offered the Brits a settlement based on a 50-50 split, which is what the Americans had just agreed to in Saudi Arabia. And they had another one-word response. No.
Are you kidding?
They refused to negotiate, and through an economic embargo around Iran, and Mossadegh's defiance of the embargo made him even more popular at home. And that embargo was reasonably effective and really started to hurt. But you have this huge nationalist fervor, and Mossadegh was the hero of the day. So MI6 figured, what's the hot button that we push to get the Americans off of the dime? We all know. They're communists. And of course there were communists in Iran, as there were all over the world. In Iran, interestingly enough, at that moment, they were one of a number of political parties. They were legal. They were participating in the political process. They were not trying to subvert the government. They were fairly small at that moment as these things go, because Mossadegh had the benefit of this huge upsurge of popular favor based on his defiance of the Brits. But the Brits were extremely skillful in persuading the Eisenhower administration that Mossadegh was secretly in league with them, with the communists, and they were going to turn Iran into a communist satellite of the Soviet Union. Now, Mossadegh wasn't, but as some of you know, I think, Bob, you know, when fact becomes myth, what do you print? You print the legend, right? What movie is that from? The Man Who Killed Liberty Valance? Right. When fact becomes legend, print the legend. And that's what MI6 did with enormous success and persuaded the Eisenhower administration that Iran was about to fall to the communists, just like we lost communist China, right? We lost it. It disappeared off the map. So Ike authorizes the CIA's Operation Ajax, together with the Brits, to overthrow Mossadegh. Donald Wilbur was the CIA case officer in direct charge. He's a fascinating guy. This is a photograph of him as a much younger man around 1933. He was a genuine Middle Eastern scholar and collector of antiquities and a world traveler, a remarkably bright, capable guy. And the reason I'm using a 1933 photograph is because in 1940 or 41, he joined the OSS, and after the war, he joined the CIA, and there are no more photographs of him. So we'll have to make do with this photograph. Because he was a genuine Middle Eastern expert with enormous experience, both on the ground and academically, they put him in charge, and they sent Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, Kim, into Iran on the ground under a false name. The only vaguely funny story, because this really isn't funny at all, there are Keystone Cops aspects to this, but it wasn't funny. He comes in with a fake name. His name is Lockridge, and he establishes himself as a well-to-do businessman while he's organizing things in secret. And he joins the local tennis club, and he plays tennis every afternoon. And when he makes a really awful shot, as I would say, "Oh, Stacy, what are you doing?" And he would say, "Ah, Roosevelt." So finally, he explained to them that in his family of right-wing Republicans, Roosevelt was a swear word. And that's why he would say, well, maybe. He flew into Tehran, apparently with somewhere between $850,000 and $1 million in cash, in small bills, to organize a secret uprising to overthrow Mossadegh. And he used the cash to do two things. First, he approaches Army Chief Zahedi, and we don't know exactly how much cash he gave him, but we know that Zahedi agreed to lead the army part of the revolt. But the army part of the revolt would be second. Roosevelt was no dummy. He also approached a series of men like the fellow on the left, Shaban Jafari, who could organize street gangs. That's phase one. First, you create riots in the street. That gives the excuse for the army to put down the riots you just created, and creates a sense that the country is coming apart at the seams and that the government has lost control of the situation. And that's what Kermit Roosevelt set out to do, and he did it very successfully. It is like a recipe you might dream up in your kitchen. Line pockets with cash, stir up riotous crowds, add in army, overthrow government. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all the things that went wrong. Everything went wrong. So much so that Alan Dulles cabled him and said, "Operation terminated, get out of Tehran." And Kermit, being the loyal CIA employee that he was, ignored him and kept at it. And his persistence overcame all of the incredibly stupid mistakes that the CIA made. I mean, you just cannot imagine what dummies they were in terms of doing things on the ground. Now, you can excuse a lot of it, with the sort of, quote, fog of war, unquote, aspect of it. Nothing, with these kinds of operations, nothing ever goes the way it's supposed to. The people you're paying off to do what you want them to do, are free to do anything they feel like once they've got their hands on your cash. So you can excuse a lot of it, and some of it is just idiotic. But his persistence paid off. In the middle of it, Shah Jr., who was supposed to take over to calm the country, got real nervous with all of these fake riots and armies in the streets. So nervous that he secretly ran to the airport, hopped on a plane, and checked into a hotel in Rome under a fake name to hide out because he was sure he was going to be assassinated. By pure coincidence, and I believe this is true, who checks into the hotel at the exact same time? Alan Dulles, and sees Shah Jr. in the lobby and says, "Little Shah, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Tehran." So they fly Donnie Wilbur in to Rome to stroke the Shah, persuade him with cash, with whatever, to go back. And in fact, Roosevelt keeps going. And soon enough, Mossadegh, who is as they say, a truly unusual personality, succumbs to the army. He cannot keep control of the army, and the army takes over. And you can see here, this is an actual shot of the army at the presidential palace or whatever, as they take over. Mossadegh was arrested, tried, convicted of treason, sentenced to die, and for reasons I have no knowledge of, the army relented and he was resentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. And indeed, he spent the rest of his life in his very comfortable country estate and died many years later. And the involvement of the Americans was kept secret. It was really quite remarkable. The little Shah gets to get back on his throne. He marries a gorgeous woman, gets boatloads of U.S. cash that he used to set up SAVAK, S-A-V-A-K. Do you remember that? That was his secret police. Actually, I shouldn't call them the secret police. They weren't secret at all. His police. He ran a police state. And the Brits got 40% of Anglo-Iranian oil profits. Not bad. Not bad, right? And the U.S., for its part in the deal, put 4 American oil companies into what became the successor company. I think it's relatively rare that the economics are so blatant. It's not rare that the economics are there, not at all. But it's rare that you see a government like the United States government just, carrying out the will of the boards of directors of these oil companies. Everyone was happy. Everybody liked the result, except for one guy. Remember him? As ye sow, so shall ye reap. You know what the CIA calls it? It's a very interesting term for this phrase exactly. They call it blowback. You blow them away and it blows back at you. Now in Guatemala, and by the way, if you have any doubt about why a portion of the Iranian population really doesn't like us very much. There are plenty of Iranians who do, particularly the younger ones. But of that generation, that's the story, ladies and gentlemen. In Guatemala, it was all about land and bananas. And bananas, up until about 1850 or 1860, were completely exotic. I think the first bananas were brought into the United States either just before or just after the Civil War. And they swept the American population. They just fell in love with them. And especially the United Fruit Company, which is actually a series of companies. The original company started in Boston. It grew through acquisitions. A lot of people were making money off bananas, and finally merged with their, decades later, with their biggest competitor in New Orleans. Remember her? Yeah. What you probably don't know, unless you read a book called The Fish That Ate the Whale, raise your hand, how many people have read The Fish That Ate the Whale? Is how gargantuan this company became.
How corrupt.
Here we are in Guatemala. This is a picture recently, but it's the exact place where tens of thousands of acres of land were left fallow by United Fruit Company, known popularly in Central America as El Pulpo, the octopus. In 1953, the United Fruit Company owned 42% of Guatemala's landmass. Can you imagine? Imagine a single company owning all the land in the United States from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi. It's unbelievable. But that's not all. I couldn't even get, there's not enough space on the slide. They owned the port. Not the docks, not those sheds and the warehouses. They owned the entire town. They owned the power grid. They owned the country's only railroad. They owned its telephone system. They owned its principal bank. Let me take a look. There's some more. They owned the telegraph system. Their profits annually, this is net, and you're not allowed to look at the books, amounted to twice the total revenue of the government of Guatemala. And most of its vast acreage was kept fallow in a country where campesinos or peasants, by the way, in America we don't call them peasants, we call them yeoman farmers, which is a much better phrase. Their yeoman farmers were desperate for land, and United Fruit Company's land was just left fallow to keep prices down. They had a dictator, a rather vicious military dictatorship, up until World War II for decades. In World War II, the upsets associated with that allowed the middle class and upper middle class, which was pretty small in Guatemala, to overthrow the dictatorship. I think the last military guy died, and that was the trigger that allowed them to take over. And by the end of the war, they had established a functioning democracy, and that government was imbued with the New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So they instituted a series of reform legislation that United Fruit Company was not too happy with. The labor reforms instituted by the government included minimum wage legislation. Oh, El Pulpo did not like that. The right of workers to organize in unions and bargain collectively. Ooh. To the executives of the United Fruit Company, there was only one word that described that: communist. Education reforms to combat widespread illiteracy were equally suspect at El Pulpo. But the new government, as you can imagine, I'm reading from Gene Edward Smith's Eisenhower, struck deep popular roots. And in March of 1951, when this democratic revolution was 7 years old, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, who had been the defense minister for a few years, became the president. Hang on, did I skip? Oh, yeah. So Guzman, I should call him Arbenz, that's how he ran. He took the next step, which was extremely popular among the citizens of Guatemala, which was to enact legislation providing for the redistribution of idle land, land that wasn't being used for anything, which was owned by United Fruit and others. And here's the most interesting thing. In many countries, when there's a similar movement and they expropriate the land, they just take it. And you can decide for yourself whether you're in favor of that or against it. In Guatemala, Arbenz, as part of the legislation, paid for the land by giving 25-year bonds guaranteed by the government, paying 3% interest, which at the time was a perfectly appropriate interest. And how was the land valued? This is the part I love. In other words, how did they decide how much per acre was going to be reflected in the amount of the bonds you would be given? They took the prior year's property tax returns filed by United Fruit Company and said, oh, that's how you value it? Fine. That's what we're paying you for it. And for those of you who know what self-appraisal is all about, so United Fruit Company persuaded the Eisenhower administration, and this is something that has been embedded very deeply into American governments for a long time. I think is really an extremely unfortunate philosophy, but it's deeply embedded in our government that, quote, land reform, unquote, equals communism. In June of 1954, Ike got a letter from an old friend of his, a publisher, who along the way said, yes, Guatemala has a few communists, but not as many as are in San Francisco. And here's Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. And unfortunately, as we'll see in a moment, he looks good, but he lacked a little backbone, like Mossadegh. And it's curious because we're going to see some rather sharp contrasts as we go forward. Here's the man who held the real power in Guatemala. He owned Guatemala. Sam Zamuri, who was just in the process of, in those years, of transitioning out of United Fruit Company, choosing to retire because I think by this time he's already 80. But he didn't disappear overnight. It was a transition of several years. He ran Guatemala. I mean, it didn't really matter up until this time. It didn't really matter what anybody in government thought because he owned it all. But United Fruit Company was so deeply embedded in the United States government, it's absolutely amazing. Their Washington lobbyist was Tom Corcoran, who was part of the inner circle of FDR, and at the end of the Roosevelt administration went into private law practice and was the most connected political man in America. Edward Bernays was this is a picture of him as a young man, was the leading marketing expert in the country. He invented what we think of as public relations. He invented public relations. And he worked for United Fruit. But it gets a little more personal. Ike's personal secretary, Ann Whitman, was married to a United Fruit Company executive. And not some minor clerk, a fairly senior executive. Beadle Smith, who had been his military chief aide and assistant during World War II and was now Deputy Secretary of State. Beadle Smith at exactly this moment was writing to United Fruit Company saying, hey, here I am, I'd love to go to work for you because I'm about to leave the government. And guess what? He did. So the CIA puts one of its best case officers in charge of what's going to be called Operation PB Success. And there he is. Somebody knows who that is.
Howard Hunt.
Thank you very much. There he is. Howard Hunt. Who said Howard Hunt? Who knew? Ah, all right. All right. Hunt reported to Tracy Barnes. Here's Tracy, in disguise, by the way. There's a picture of him without the slick back hair, the bow tie, and the glasses. He looks quite different. And Barnes reported to Wisner, who's over here. Wisner was already very senior. Wisner had come out of the OSS and ultimately ended up in a mental hospital, and I think he may have committed suicide. Very sad end to a very long and, from Eisenhower's point of view, a very distinguished career. Wisner reported to Richard Bissell and Alan Dulles. Dulles reported to Ike, or at least that's what Dulles said he did. And I think he probably did. Bissell was emerging as a powerhouse within the CIA and ultimately became the second in command for a reason that we saw last week, but we're not going to talk about it. It's Bissell who ran the U-2 program from beginning to end, starting in 55, and then when it got up in the air in 56, right through 60. And there is no intelligence operation of greater significance in the last 50 years than the U-2, because for the first time, it opened up a window into the Soviet Union. It gave us our first serious panoramic look behind the Iron Curtain. You know, let me just take a brief aside. After World War II, as the Cold War evolved, we knew we had to understand better what was going on in the Soviet Union. So under Truman, we sent, I believe, hundreds of former residents of Eastern European countries and the republics of the Soviet Union undercover. Sometimes we sent them in across borders with fake papers. Sometimes they parachuted in at night. Sometimes they came in on beaches off of submarines. We made an enormous effort to give them fake papers, secret radios, all the best technology. And you know what? Every single one of them disappeared. And the assumption is that every single one of them was immediately caught and executed. We're talking about a massive effort that was 100% failure. So you can imagine how desperate Eisenhower and his senior people were to find a way to look into the Soviet Union, to see what was going on, because they were so secretive. I mean, really, really secretive. And the U-2 was like suddenly, you know, wow, you could see everything. And Bissell ran it from day one. He was the guy who got it up and running and then ran it. Yes, sir.
But you said that that's the best thing in the last 50 years, but satellites took over from the U-2 in a much better way.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. 100% correct.
We didn't have them.
But by that time, well, you know what? You're 100% correct. So these are the guys that are going to run this operation. Here's Bissell. He was a high-stakes poker player, a risk taker. He said, if you don't take risks, you don't get rewards. What you need are brilliant people like me, Richard Bissell, to manage the risks, and you'll get the reward. Tracy Barnes chose Colonel Castillo-Armas. His first name was Carlos Castillo-Armas. He was a colonel self-appointed to lead a rebel army to overthrow Arbenz. That's him on the left. You can see, even though it's supposed to be secret, the U.S. ambassador was involved. We put in people on the ground. And here's the rebel army. Are you ready for this? This is going to overthrow a country's entire defense forces. That's it. There were 517 of them. Yes, sir.
First string or second string?
This is the first string. Something like 200 of them one day ran into a platoon of the Guatemalan regular army. A platoon. How many people in a platoon?
20.
20? 30? Maybe 50? What? No? No, platoons is smaller. 20 or 30?
No, about 10.
All right. So a platoon of the Guatemalan regular army wiped these guys out. Why did they join? Very simple. They were paid 10 times what United Fruit paid its field hands. $300 a month, that was big money. They had a rebel air force, all American, old B-26s, flown by Americans who had to resign their army commissions. And
B-26s. Those are old planes.
yeah, that's exactly right. They took them out of junkyards. Now, actually, I don't want you to read that yet. How many people saw the movie Wag the Dog? Anybody? You remember the character played by Dustin Hoffman and his pal? They set up a virtual war, right? A fake war. Now, the part I don't remember is why were they doing that? To get somebody elected president? Was that? Yeah. Was that it? And it was a hilarious movie, and the script was brilliant, right? And I remember thinking, who would think up something like this? These scriptwriters are fabulous. Well, guess what? In 1953, the CIA set up a powerful clandestine radio station in neighboring Honduras, jammed all the Guatemalan stations, and ran a virtual war over the airwaves. You know, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. Except in this case it was, the rebels are coming. They just captured this town, they captured that town. And Arbenz panicked. He literally panicked. We sent in a couple of these old airplanes to drop a bomb or two on the national capital, Guatemala City, you know, to boom, boom, boom. And he wanted to save his people from massive bloodshed. It was literally a virtual war. Really. Now you're going to see a contrast with this behavior very shortly. Again, I can't bore you. It's almost worth reading about in detail because it's the ultimate Keystone Cops. Everything that could go wrong went wrong. And they just kept at it until Arbenz ran away. Here's Colonel Armas right here. See, is this the microphone right here? Addressing the adoring crowds from the balcony of the presidential palace. There's only one thing wrong with that. They had no idea who he was. He was a complete nobody. But they soon learned. Here he is as president, and his 3 years in office were enough for United Fruit to reassert control. He was succeeded by other military types. Guatemala's land reform law, Decree 900, was promptly repealed. Surprise! And what followed was 30 years of military dictatorship, civil war, right-wing death squads with at least 100,000 civilians dead. Many historians say it's actually twice that number. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. Well, it ultimately did have a happy ending. In 1986, they had a more or less democratic election. This guy came in, President Cerezo, and actually things have slowly improved. Now, why did, some of you may have been to Guatemala on vacation.
I just came back from Costa Rica, and what we learned was that Costa Rica has a 96% rate of literacy because they never had an army. They put their monies to education. When I went to a pineapple plantation, a coffee plantation, it was Guatemalans working it because they're still very poor. Yeah. And they would come into Costa Rica, so it's still a long way to go.
It's a long road. It's a long road. United Fruit Company's record of paying profits to its investors is superb. Its record as a landholder and as a corporate citizen in the various countries where bananas are grown is somewhat less than wonderful. It's really worth reading The Fish That Ate the Whale. It's a remarkable history. Now, why did he do it? The key to Eisenhower's philosophy in this regard is that he let himself be talked into believing the equation that land reform equals communism. And it is still to this day deeply embedded in American government and American political circles. And interestingly enough, his brother Milton, who I knew as the president of Johns Hopkins, the great liberal educational institute,
Almost a Columbia.
played a big role in persuading him. He wrote him a very important letter just before Ike authorized the overthrow of the Arbenz government, because he had taken a tour of South American countries. He never went to Guatemala, Milton, in this tour. Never went to it. But he said that that's what's happening. They're turning communistic. And he reached that conclusion without having ever been there and literally knowing nothing about it. But Milt was a very important part of Eisenhower's life. They were very close, and he paid attention. Ike also wanted to persuade his Republican right wing that he was serious about rolling back communism. And here it is in the Western Hemisphere. It's not enough to contain it. You got to roll it back. So there's a perfect opportunity. And it was cheap. Remember, a lot of Eisenhower's new look and brinksmanship and don't mess with me or I'll nuke you was to save money. Remember, we talked about how he cut the army down from 1 million men to, from 1.5 million men to 1 million, and cut back a lot of other aspects of the Defense Department budget. And this was cheap. That was important. You could get good results without having to send in the troops, no mess, and it would be secret. What could be better than having all of these benefits, and it's secret. You don't have to explain it to anybody. And everyone was happy except for one keen young Argentinian observer who by purest chance happened to be in Guatemala at the very time that all these events occurred. You got it. You're too smart for me. That's Shea at the age of 22. Good-looking young man. Jeez, and I thought I was a half a chapter ahead of you guys. Now there's another incident that occurs that we'll only take 1 second on. 4 years later, a CIA field agent was caught in a sting operation in Syria while he was trying to use American cash to bribe Syrian officers to overthrow the government. I'd never heard of that until a few weeks ago. And that's why I say I wonder if there aren't other efforts, perhaps more successful, that have occurred that we just don't know about. But it was pretty embarrassing. Allen Dulles was aging fast and may not have, first of all, he was a terrible manager, but by this time he was really losing his grip on the everyday work of running the agency. There was Ike, under pressure, Ike got a little committee together to review the agency's work, and in particular, Allen Dulles, and they unanimously recommended that Dulles be replaced. He refused, and his upset, because this was embarrassing, didn't stop him from continuing to try to overthrow governments that he didn't like. And Indonesia moved into Ike's gun sights because Sukarno was neutral. And you probably remember how there was this whole third world movement of players who didn't want to be in the Western camp or in the Soviet camp. They wanted to be neutral. And this is a relatively, not a really rare photograph, but a relatively rare photograph of Nasser, Sukarno, and Nehru, the three big leaders of the movement to stay out of both orbits, both the Soviet orbit and the American orbit. And in those days, saying that you don't really want to be in either orbit and that you're perfectly willing to deal with both sides was the same as being a communist among certain circles. Being neutral, you're a communist. The three of them also ran into trouble with America because each of the three of them were incredibly skillful at playing off the one side against the other. And we were not as skillful as they were all the time. So Sukarno, as the president, in fact, he was the George Washington of his country, which was amazing because during World War II, when he was a young and rising politician and very important in Indonesian affairs, he had to make a choice between the Japanese and the Americans. And he made a little mistake. He picked the Japanese. And that came to haunt him at the end of World War II. But he was so skillful, I'm talking about Sukarno, that he rose to become really the leader of the new Indonesia that had to fight against the Dutch. You know, the Indonesia had been owned as a colony by the Dutch for 150 years. And Sukarno had a struggle against the Dutch, who came back in at the end of the war to reassert themselves. And Sukarno was successful. He wasn't a communist himself, but over the course of his presidency, because being a member of the Communist Party was legal, and it was just another political party among many, but over the course of his presidency, for a whole variety of local Indonesian reasons, the Communist Party became the largest political force in the country. And it was a very important country for the United States, both in terms of its strategic position in the Pacific and because of all of its raw materials. And we thought that we needed to have a friend in Indonesia. At Ike's request, the CIA decides in 1958 to replace him. You don't like him? He's got to go. First, the CIA spent $1 million on an Islamic party. I mean, a rigorous Islamic party to try to influence the elections and have the communists voted out. Unfortunately, the Islamists lost. Then the CIA used some more cash, we don't know how much, but undoubtedly a lot, to bribe senior Indonesian generals to topple Sukarno. They refused. Then they tried to discredit Sukarno with fake pornographic lookalike photos, and they actually made a pornographic film. The CIA, in 1958, made a pornographic film using a body double who looked just like Sukarno to try to discredit him. What they didn't understand was two things, and this is part of the Keystone Cops aspect of it. Number one, Sukarno was a ladies' man beyond all belief. He divorced his first wife because she wouldn't agree to let him marry 3 or 4 or 5 wives, because it was legal then to have, polygamy was legal for men. He gloried in squiring around gorgeous women from all over the world, and that enhanced his popularity. That's the thing that the CIA didn't get. The Indonesian people loved it, that their leader was, you know, a brilliant swordsman. And the lack of basic understanding of the local native culture is something that you would think that the CIA would be best at. In fact, the picture that I always had of the CIA, which I now realize is from the movies, you know, is of these brilliant, analytic, very knowledgeable people. And by the way, there are undoubtedly plenty of those somewhere buried in the basement of the agency. But most important is that the CIA failed because Sukarno was a real tough guy. I mean, a real tough guy. Totally unlike Mossadegh and Arbenz, who in their own personalities were weak, spineless. Sukarno had a spine made of steel, tempered steel. You don't mess with a guy who's been through what he had been through by this time. What the CIA thought they would be able to do at one and the same time, this was their plan. We'll get all of these little groups that are in the outer islands that are in rebellion against the idea of a central authority. All kinds of different tribes, groups. They're all in these outer islands of Indonesia, because as you know, Indonesia has a few big islands like Java, but then it has all of these little islands, and there were rebel groups all over. We'll send money and arms to them, says the CIA, and get them to create, as in Tehran, they'll create the riots and the upset and the government doesn't have any control. And we'll bribe the generals who hate these groups. We'll pay them to go out and fight against them. And in the tumult that emerges, we'll get one of these generals to kick Sukarno out and take over. Well, the generals didn't buy into any of that. And these little groups who got loads of American arms and equipment and supplies were beaten to a pulp by the various army groups that went out after them. So the whole thing was a complete failure. And not only that, when some of the army units captured these rebels, they discovered that their rifles said on the rifle barrel, "Made in Michigan." And Sukarno, by the end of this campaign, knew exactly what the Americans were up to. But far from getting on a plane and running off to Bali and hiding in the basement of a hotel, this tough guy cleaned up the mess, kicked, well, let me use a more civilized phrase, defeated them, kept the army loyal to him, and ran the country. So their whole plan of having these native rebels fight and bring down Sukarno fell to pieces. But before that effort was over, Bissell, realizing that things are not going well, says we better get some air power in there. And he sent in a group of American pilots who, again, they had to resign their commissions first. This guy was a lieutenant in the Air Force, to fly these old planes and try to bomb the Army into submission. This Alan Lawrence Pope has written extensively about his experiences. He was shot down when the Indonesian Air Force got really, and in fact the whole Indonesian establishment got really angry with him because after successfully doing a couple of bombing runs against military targets, for reasons that have never been made clear, he bombed a marketplace and a hospital. Probably accidental, probably. And he was condemned to death. And then Sukarno did a very interesting thing. He didn't execute him, stuck him away, and let some years pass. And when Kennedy became president, Sukarno wanted to be friends with America, so he let him go. And he literally, Sukarno personally took him to the airplane that was going to send him back to America. And I'll read it to you. This is what Sukarno said to Pope. "I want no propaganda about it. Now go. Lose yourself in the USA secretly. Don't show yourself publicly. Don't give out news stories. Don't issue statements. Just go home. Hide yourself. Get lost, and we'll forget the whole thing." He did. Pope stayed silent for many, many years, and the whole thing was hushed up. But I love what Pope finally did talk about, what he did say when he started talking about it many, many years later. "I enjoy killing communists. They said Indonesia was a failure," meaning the CIA effort was a failure. "But we knocked the blankety-blank out of them. We killed thousands of communists, even though half of them probably didn't even know what communism meant." Ladies and gentlemen, half? How about 99%? But this guy, Sukarno, tough guy. For his own reasons, he moved away, having nothing to do with America. In fact, he made it a point, despite the fact that he uncovered the whole CIA plan and defeated it. He never confronted Eisenhower. He never became an enemy of the United States. He had a longer-term vision of where his interests and Indonesian interests lay. But in 1965, the Communist Party had become so big and powerful that for reasons of their own, they tried to overthrow Sukarno, and there was a bloodbath. I mean, a real bloodbath. Hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million. The Communist Party was either, membership was either killed or put in jail. Excuse me. Very little left. And that process, that repression of the putsch by the communists, brought Suharto to the fore. You may notice, by the way, I'm not using any first names. That's because they don't have first names. Very efficient, no time to waste. It's just Sukarno and Suharto. Here he is, just as he's emerging on the scene as an important political figure, at a funeral for 5 generals killed during the putsch attempt. And here he is as president by 1968. First he was acting president, then he was fully president, and he stayed in power for 30 years. Another tough guy.
Was there anybody behind the communist push? Did the Soviets get involved or somebody else in order to add power to it?
I've read a tiny bit about it, and I don't think that anything that I've read is definitive. What I can tell you is this. Both the Soviets and especially the Chinese would have been very interested in backing it. But the little I've read said that the native-born Indonesians who formed the Communist Party were most involved as Indonesians. And it was really their attempt to take over the country. They were huge by that time. They were really huge. So while it wouldn't surprise me, particularly if the Chinese were involved, it wasn't started by the Chinese or the Russians. It was started by the native Indonesian communists. Yes?
Well, it seems that it was not the CIA's policy at that time to have leaders assassinated, because they could have probably assassinated him, but
Just wait.
I know that. That's what I'm just saying.
But you're
at
right.
that time.
You're right. They had
I know
a
it's
bigger
come
picture.
later, yeah.
They had a bigger picture. They wanted to overthrow the entire government. One guy was not enough. Now we got to turn to Cuba. And there's nobody in this room is old enough to remember what Cuba was like before Castro. You remember Fulgencio Batista? And what you had were a tyrannical, corrupt military dictatorship that was run for the benefit of the wealthy. You had an enormous mass of campesinos, of landless peasants. You had an incredibly repressive regime. Americans loved going to Havana for all of the hotels and casinos, which were owned and run by the American mafia, rather openly. There was vast illiteracy. There was starvation. This was a bad, bad, bad situation. Even those who are most opposed to Castro will not argue that things were good under Fulgencio Batista, unless you were part of his inner political circle or inner military circle, or were one of the few wealthy landowners. By the way, in 1958, I spent the summer at Andover Summer School, the prep school. My roommate was from El Salvador. By the end of the summer, I finally understood that he was a member of one of the 6 families that owned the entire country. All of it. Right? The United Fruit Company only owned 42% of the land. These 6 families owned 100% of El Salvador. So it wasn't just Guatemala. This was, well, first of all, as far as the United Fruit Company was concerned, it's wherever the climate and the soil would allow you to grow bananas. But in Cuba before Castro, to understand Castro, to understand his immense popularity for many years, to understand why the people put up with all the bad things he did, you have to understand what it was like before Castro. Medical care, forget about it. Education, forget about it. Right? Freedom to express your own views, well, you got to do it once. I love these pictures. This, of course, is a somewhat older Che Guevara, Castro. This is a guy named, his name has disappeared from our history, but he's very well known. Dennis Hopper, right, yeah. It'll come to me. These guys came out of the mountains where they'd been hiding out for 8 years. You remember at an earlier stage, a bunch of them at a much smaller, earlier stage had been captured by Batista's army. A bunch of them were executed. Why they didn't execute Castro, I really don't know. He talked them out of it. They put him on trial. And it was the Batista, a show trial, with 3 judges who were there to hang him. And he was so eloquent, he talked them out of convicting him of the most serious crimes, and that's why he was sentenced to 30 years. And then he got out, went to the mountains, reformed, learned his lesson, and came back very, very successfully. And whatever else you may think about them, and if we were in Miami and I was talking only to people who left Cuba because they hated Castro, I would say the same thing to them. Whatever else you may think about Castro and his guerrilla force and his government, they were genuine revolutionaries. Revolutionaries, what does the word revolution mean? You turn things upside down. That's what they did. They turned things upside down. They killed a bunch of people. They put a bunch of people in jail. They tortured some people. But for the mass of Cuban campesinos, all of a sudden there was the possibility of a life. Now, that may not be your bread and butter. Would I have wanted to live in Cuba during any time in the last 50 years? No. But if I was born a campesino, would I prefer education and medical care and a piece of land and safety and security over Batista? Yes, I would.
They threw out the capitalists.
Yeah, well, the one thing that Castro did that in hindsight was truly brilliant, because he did execute a whole bunch of people and put a whole bunch of people in jail. But the mass of the upper middle class and wealthy people who would have been the natural source of a counter-revolution, he let them go. And where did they come? Welcome aboard. We're delighted to have you. It was all the people who wanted to be capitalistic and entrepreneurial and who loved the idea of being in America after they got over their missing Cuba. And they've become a vibrant part of American life. And in hindsight, it's so clear that part of the reason he's stayed in power, part of the reason, is because all the people who were opposed to them, if they weren't dead, came to the United States. Now, the United States, once it became clear, and it took about a year before it really became clear that he was, that Castro was in favor of state socialism. But once it became clear that they were intent on state socialism and that part of what they were going to do was confiscate much of the privately owned property and facilities and factories, we decided this boy's not for us. We're not giving him any aid. We're not going to give Cuba any assistance. So Cuba had to look elsewhere. By the way, you know who was maddest at Castro? And this goes to this lady's comment. The mafia were infuriated with him because the first thing he did was expropriate their casinos and shut them down. The second thing he did was to expropriate the hotels and run them for the benefit of the state. In fact, he turned a lot of them into vacation resorts for peasants. And that doesn't sit well with the mafia. And the third thing he did was outlaw prostitution and enforce it rather vigorously, and created and this is in quotes, the new Cuban man and the new Cuban women. He made it, in the first 10 years especially, he made an enormous effort to change the culture and the mindset of the Cuban people, I'm talking about the campesinos, to be free and independent up to a point. So Cuba had to look somewhere else for help besides the United States. My pal, Nicky. Now, notice in this picture, they're clearly friends, shoulder to shoulder, right? Now they're kissing cousins. Right? You can't fake that smile, right? And here they are on the top of the Kremlin. That's the ultimate honor in the former Soviet Union. You get to stand up with all these happy guys. He's about to emerge. This is Brezhnev, but Khrushchev is still in the center. I don't know, if I had gone, the whole 9 yards to help out the Soviet Union, I would want a little bigger reward than standing on top of the Kremlin. But that was the big deal. And in the early days, before it was really clear what a revolutionary he was, there was real communication between the US and Cuba. There you see Nixon with his eyes closed, shaking hands. Remember, it's just like eating food off of your spouse's plate. If you shake hands with the devil, but you have your eyes closed, it doesn't count. And it was exactly in these conversations that the United States government started to really understand what Castro was all about, and they didn't like it. They especially didn't like it over the next year, 60-61, because as he took his place on the world stage, here he is at the UN, he became enormously popular and influential in the third world. Enormously popular. And a little part, not the biggest part, but a little part of his popularity was the way, 90 miles off of the Florida coast, he could thumb his nose at us, which he did joyfully on every occasion. And in fact, he loved especially to come to New York City, to the UN, and do it in New York City, where he would lecture. Remember, this is 1959. He would lecture the American government about how blacks and Hispanics were treated in the United States. And it was, to say the least, a little upsetting to hear the truth spoken from afar. But he was amazingly charismatic, and the fact that he was also imprisoning and torturing people back in Cuba did not bulk so large when he was at a world rostrum like this.
I think they confiscated the large property.
Yes, he certainly did. U.S.-Cuban relations went from bad to worse when he made clear that he wasn't going to have state socialism just in Cuba. He was going to actively support revolutionary movements throughout Central and South America. Actively, as you know. And that's when Eisenhower said, enough is enough, we can't have this. And he decided that Castro had to go in March of 1960. So in March of 1960, under Bissell's direction, the CIA drafts a policy paper outlining their newest secret operation, JMARC, to bring about the replacement of the Castro regime with one acceptable to the U.S., but to avoid any appearance of U.S. intervention. And Bissell thinks that this is going to be the capstone. This is the operation that is going to lead to him becoming Dulles' successor as the head of the CIA. little did he know. The problem was that time ran out on the Republicans. Eisenhower really thought until the very end that Nixon would beat Kennedy. Because until after Kennedy had been in office a while, he thought of Kennedy from his early days in the Senate, and he thought of him as a lightweight, a playboy, a debutante, just not a serious player. And he was startled in the closing days of the campaign when his advisors, when I say he, Eisenhower was startled in the closing days of the campaign when he was advised that Nixon was probably going to lose. But remember, unlike Eisenhower, who refused to go in and have coffee with Truman on the day of the inauguration, Kennedy skipped right in, and here's the two of them on the steps of the White House just before they get in the car together to go over to have Kennedy sworn in. Once Ike had read Bissell's March report, he authorized $13 million to get the operation going. But it took quite a while to get the operation going. They had to find Cuban expatriates with military experience, train them. They had learned their lesson from Guatemala. They were looking for real soldiers with real training, with real equipment. But time ran out, and he literally, Eisenhower had to hand the operation over to Kennedy. So he gets briefed by Dulles and Bissell, and Kennedy does not like what he hears. And in hindsight, it's pretty clear he didn't understand what Bissell was trying to achieve and how he was trying to achieve it. He sent the report, Kennedy sent the report to the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff and asked them to vet it, V-E-T, to do an analysis and critique. Well, the kind of guys who get to be five-star generals or admirals or whatever, you show them a CIA secret operation, they're not going to like it. They unanimously said it was stupid. But instead of just tearing it up and throwing it away, JFK said to Bissell, this doesn't fly, it doesn't work, give me a different plan. And he made a mistake. He said, the problem is, it's going to be perfectly obvious. This thing is so big, it's going to be obvious that it's us. And you say the whole point is we're going to do it in secret. And Bissell came back with a plan that was so cut down to keep it secret that it was doomed to failure. And allegedly, Bissell thought, allegedly, that it would be okay if it initially failed, because once we get boots on the ground, Kennedy will have no choice. He'll have to send in the Marines. That's what he thought. Apparently, a number of different historians and commentators who knew Bissell have said that that was what his strategy was. Yeah, if you had asked Bissell in private, plan number 2, is that really better than plan? No, it's far worse. So it begins on April 15, 1961. And what you have to remember, ladies and gentlemen, is that's barely 3.5 months after Kennedy has come into office. You know, and what was the last thing he commanded? A PT boat. You know what happened to his PT boat? You're right. Thank goodness we weren't on that PT boat. That's why when you think back on it, Lincoln was such a genius. He didn't even have a PT boat. He knew nothing about war, nothing about diplomacy, nothing about being a commander-in-chief, and he educated himself, and he was brilliant. But they put boots on the ground, April 15, 1961, and the thing goes from bad to worse to awful. Some more old B-26s. We must have had a stockpile of old chunky B-26s to beat the band. The Cubans shot them down. And at a given point, when Bissell guessed that things were bad enough on the ground and he reported to JFK, they're about to get wiped out, Bissell guessed that he'd send in fighter jets at the very least, and JFK said no, pulled the plug. So we're not doing that. With whatever consequences you can imagine. And of course, what the CIA had also vastly underestimated was two things. Number one, his army was well-trained, well-armed, well-prepared, well-motivated, and well-led. I'll say that again. I like it. Well-trained, well-armed, well-prepared, well-motivated, and well-led. But there was a second thing. The Cuban people, who were supposed to rise up and welcome the invaders and forget about it. This was at a stage when they loved Castro. Yes?
CIA repeated that in Iraq.
That's another course for another time, Bob. Actually, you should be the teacher of that course. Victory for Cuba. And I'm sure that everybody in this room remembers both the newspapers and the TV, but unless you were Jack Kennedy yourself, the humiliation must have been horrible beyond belief. Horrible beyond belief. Here you become the President of the United States, and little Cuba just, swats you away and embarrasses the heck out of you on the world stage. For the invasion force itself, there was nothing funny. Nothing funny. A lot of them were executed immediately upon being captured, if they hadn't already been killed. A lot of them were imprisoned, and actually he kept them, a bunch of them, for 30 years in jail.
Stacy, any idea what the other plan A was that was rejected?
Yeah, it was a much bigger plan that involved much more substantial U.S. support, particularly using the Navy to get them over there quicker. One of the problems, and this is the Keystone Cops aspect, these guys here up on the screen, they don't think it was so funny. They wouldn't use the Navy to get them from, was it Honduras, where they were training at the end, over to Cuba. If they had put them on naval ships at night, they could have gotten them there overnight, and it would have been a surprise. It took them so long in their little rusty boats to get there that the Cubans knew exactly that they were coming, how many, where they were going to land. And that's one example of what Plan A would have avoided. There was going to be a much more substantial force, a much more substantial U.S. backing militarily. But that would have failed too, because even Plan A had those two basic flaws. Number one, it underestimated how well trained and armed and motivated the Cuban army was. And number two, it didn't understand that the Cuban people were going to oppose any invasion by anybody. But, that's also part of what ifs. I don't know what if. Bissell apparently thought that if he could get enough boots on the ground, the entire force of the American military would come into play. And he was wrong. And here I've tried to raise as questions were Ike's actions in Iran, Guatemala, Indonesia, and Cuba constitutional or unconstitutional? Was it legal or illegal? Was it moral or immoral? Just or unjust? Effective or ineffective? And because it's late in the day, why don't we let me close with just a minute or two, but let's start with the last class. The last class, we'll come back to these questions because in my own mind, this was an amazingly sharp divergence from the policy of the United States for the previous 200 years. And I think it's fair to say that as it gradually emerged over the next 20 years after Eisenhower left office, and some of it has only emerged, since 2000, and some of it, I'm sure, is still secret. Even under these Freedom of Information Acts that newspapers like the New York Times or organizations like CNN bring in the courts, and it takes them 10 years of litigation to finally get the CIA to reveal documents from 50 years ago. And when you get them, half of it's black lined out, So it's not clear but I think that it's something to think about, and I really want to open up the last class with a discussion about this. Because, for example, and I'll end on this note, is there a similarity between our current program with drones, which are highly effective, apparently, against a real enemy, not fake enemies? But is it legal? Is it moral? Do the ends justify the means? And many people say, well, if the ends don't justify the means, nothing justifies the means. Of course, it's the ends that have to justify the means. But are the means within the power of the executive to do in secret? And I think there's a lot of commonality in the issues. I'm not trying to suggest what the answers are, but in the issues that were raised by Eisenhower's secret program of overthrowing governments he didn't like. Thank you very much.